In a world where technology, wealth, and globalization are at their peak, it might seem surprising that food insecurity continues to affect millions of people worldwide. Yet, right now, food insecurity is a growing concern for many nations, impacting not only the poorest countries but also some of the wealthiest. What's causing this crisis and why are so many nations facing food shortages despite an abundance of resources? Let's dive into the factors behind the growing food insecurity crisis. The number one factor contributing to food insecurity is climate change. Rising global temperatures, extreme weather events, prolonged droughts, and floods are affecting agricultural productivity all over the world. Crops that were once reliable are now facing irregular growing seasons, reduced yields, and, in some regions, complete crop failures. In countries like India, which is one of the world's largest producers of rice, farmers have reported decreased rice harvests due to unpredictable monsoon patterns. In sub-Saharan Africa, where many rely on rain-fed agriculture, droughts have devastated crops, leading to food shortages and increased prices. Global food systems depend on predictable weather patterns, but as climate change accelerates, these systems are being thrown into chaos. For countries with large rural populations dependent on agriculture, this is an existential crisis. War and conflict are also major contributors to food insecurity, especially in regions already struggling with poverty. In countries like Yemen, Syria, and South Sudan, ongoing conflicts have disrupted food production, distribution, and access. These conflicts destroy infrastructure, limit farmers' ability to cultivate land, and disrupt supply chains. Moreover, displaced populations, refugees, and internally displaced people often struggle to find food either because they fled their homes or because the areas they are relocated to lack sufficient resources. The longer conflicts continue, the more difficult it becomes for nations to recover from their food security challenges, as agricultural systems and economies are decimated. For example, in Yemen, the ongoing civil war has led to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with millions facing hunger. The blockade on Yemeni ports has also limited access to food and other vital supplies, exacerbating the situation. Another significant factor driving food insecurity is economic instability and poverty. High inflation, unemployment, and stagnant wages make it difficult for families to afford basic food items, even when food is available. The economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with supply chain disruptions, has caused food prices to skyrocket in many countries. Countries with weaker economies are particularly vulnerable. In places like Venezuela and Lebanon, inflation has caused food prices to become so inflated that many families can no longer afford to buy enough food to feed themselves. The situation in these countries highlights how economic instability can lead directly to food insecurity, even in countries that have historically been food producers. The global supply chain crisis that began in 2020 has worsened food insecurity for many countries. The pandemic led to labor shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and the closure of factories, all of which disrupted the production and movement of food. The war in Ukraine, for instance, disrupted the supply of wheat, a staple for many nations, especially in the Middle East and Africa. The shortage of essential goods like fertilizers and machinery also limits agricultural productivity. Developing countries, which are heavily dependent on imported food, find it increasingly difficult to secure sufficient supplies, leading to increased food prices and diminished availability. Many countries are facing this challenge now, with rising prices of basic food staples like wheat, maize, and cooking oil. These disruptions not only affect the availability of food, but also make it more difficult for nations to access essential supplies that support their agricultural sectors. As the global population continues to grow, the demand for food is at an all-time high. Overpopulation strains food systems, particularly in urban areas, where populations are increasing faster than food production can keep up. In many cities, food is often scarce, and access to fresh produce can be limited, leaving people to rely on cheaper, less nutritious options. The rapid pace of urbanization also affects agricultural land availability. As more people move to cities, farmland is converted into urban developments, reducing the amount of land available for food production. The growing urban population must then rely on rural areas for food, and when those areas experience droughts, floods, or other disruptions, the urban populations feel the impact. In densely populated countries like India and Nigeria, the issue is especially pronounced. Even though these nations produce large quantities of food, internal inequality and inefficiency in food distribution systems result in food insecurity for millions of their citizens. While food production in the world is at record levels, the distribution of that food remains highly unbalanced. Food waste is another issue that exacerbates the crisis. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, approximately one-third of all food produced globally is wasted, whether it's due to poor handling, spoilage, or discarded products in stores and homes. In wealthier nations, food waste is often a result of overproduction and consumer behavior, whereas in poorer nations, food loss often occurs due to lack of infrastructure for storage and transportation. This mismatch between food waste in high-income countries and food scarcity in low-income countries adds a layer of complexity to the global food security issue. The distribution of food resources is deeply tied to economic inequalities. Countries that produce more food have more access to global markets, while nations that struggle economically are often unable to import sufficient amounts of food, even though there is enough food being produced worldwide. Trade policies can also play a role in food insecurity. Countries that rely on imports to meet their food needs are vulnerable to fluctuations in international food prices. When trade barriers go up, such as tariffs or export bans, it can make food more expensive and less accessible. For instance, when India imposed a ban on rice exports in 2023 due to domestic concerns about food security, it sent shockwaves through global rice markets, especially affecting countries in Southeast Asia and Africa that rely on Indian rice. Similarly, global trade wars or sanctions can disrupt the food supply chain, making it more difficult for countries to access necessary imports. In many developing countries, outdated agricultural practices, lack of access to modern farming technology, and poor infrastructure hinder the ability to produce food efficiently. Smallholder farmers may struggle with low crop yields due to outdated techniques and a lack of access to resources like high-quality seeds, irrigation, and machinery. Moreover, poor infrastructure means that even if food is produced, it can't always be transported to where it's needed most.